Well, when it comes to corruption, Latin America is as good, well, more accurately, as bad as it gets. In Mexico, though, there is some hope there may be change. The president-elect Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, known as AMLO, says he will end corruption. And the chances, well, we shall see. But could his stance at least encourage more countries to follow his lead? You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. The voters have had enough. They are demanding change. By the end of this year, 6 Latin American countries will have held elections. So far, 5 of them have delivered decisive losses to the governing parties of all political stripes. Corruption, violence, and inequality have been major issues in every country.
When it comes to transparency, Latin America doesn't score well. It routinely ranks as one of the most corrupt areas in the world. But populations are suffering and voters are demanding change, as Latin America making moves to clean up corruption. Mexico's newly elected president has delivered a promise.
No actuaremos de manera arbitraria ni habrá confiscación o expropiación de bienes. La transformación que llevaremos a cabo consistirá básicamente en desterrar la corrupción de nuestro país.
The election has been seen as a turning point for Mexico. Not only does it have a new left-leaning president-elect, it's also managed to ruin the party that once ruled it for over 70 years. Anti-establishment politics is sweeping across Latin America. Along with Mexico, Costa Rica, Paraguay, Venezuela and Colombia have already gone to the polls this year, and Brazil will too in October. By the end of the year, it's estimated 2/3 of the region's more than 600 million people will have a new leader. Corruption and crime appear to be the main drivers for change. A recent study found more than half of people across Latin America felt their government wasn't doing enough to control the problem. Corruption in Latin America dates back decades. Dictatorships have dominated the region, and under some leaders, so has corruption and crime. Recent corruption scandals in Brazil have claimed not only business elites, but presidents too. However, the tide is turning. Voters are being moved by a desire for cleaner government and a rejection of entrenched political parties. Corruption has become a campaign issue in many countries, and it's winning elections. Could more follow Mexico and vote against the status quo? It's Latin America's second biggest economy, but on the Corruption Perceptions Index, it currently stands at 135 out of 180 countries. Mexico's president-elect wants to approach the entrenched problems in a more diplomatic way. Can he make realistic changes, and what will it mean to relations across the region? Is this the first step towards the end of corruption in Latin America?
Very pleased to say that joining us from Mexico City, we have the writer Levi Vonk, who says that a lot of Mexicans do believe that AMLO can clean up their country. With me in the studio, we have Mara Polgovsky from the Center of Latin American Studies at the University of Cambridge. Francisco Dominguez is with us, a specialist on Latin America's political economy at Middlesex University. And Lupita Valdez from the Institute of the Americas at University College London. Thank you all very much for coming in. Francisco, let me go to you first of all. It's a bold claim, isn't it, to say I am going to banish corruption from my country. How's he going to do that?
Well, I think he's got a popular mandate, which is quite dramatic. I think it's the largest in the history of Mexico, of a president winning so robustly. He's got a majority in all the governorships. He's got the presidency. He's got a majority in the Senate. He's got a majority in the Congress. And I think he's got a majority in majorities as well. So he's got a very nice framework to do it. He's suggesting that the best way to do this is by making institutions which exist already, which practice corruption, accountable to some popular scrutiny. And all he needs to do, and I know this sounds easy.
All he needs to do.
All he needs to do is to ensure that these people are empowered through existing legal institutions that actually can make these institutions and individuals accountable. And if that works, it will take a while, but it can be done.
But part of the problem, Mara, perhaps, is that he has a majority in all of the institutions that Francisco mentions, but he doesn't necessarily have a majority amongst those who take the bribes and want the bribes.
That's an interesting point. There will be a lot of approaching to the, let's say, the police forces that have been living in a state of turmoil for the past 12 years to actually have to change the culture of governance. And this will have to be done both more proactively and through social programs that offer opportunities, for instance, for this youth that is joining like the criminal gangs, to in a way, create a culture of sustainability. Mm-hmm. Because one thing is to say, you know, no more corruption. What are the alternatives? What are the structural reasons for corruption? You need incentives, and you need opportunities and possibilities.
Crikey. Levi, let me bring you in from Mexico City. To give people incentives, you have to have, perhaps, as Mara is suggesting here, social programs. To have social programs, you have to have money. And yet AMLO is saying austerity. We've got to have austerity. You can have the shirt off my back if it means this country can survive. Can you have the two together?
Well, sure. I think that, you know, AMLO, a lot of promises that he's been making have somewhat lacked in substantial policy frameworks or timelines. But as mayor of Mexico City, AMLO proved himself an extremely competent steward of public monies and works, and he's credited for reviving Mexico City and making it the international powerhouse that it is today. So if anyone can pull it off, AMLO's starting to assemble a team that seems like maybe they can create some of these incentives and figure out how to redistribute some resources within the country.
What makes him different in your opinion? In fact, not just your opinion, but everybody else around the table. I'll start with you, Levi, since we're in Mexico at the moment.
Sure. I mean, AMLO is different, one, because of it. He has this historic momentum behind him. His party, Morena, that he founded is only 4 years old, and now they've essentially swept every aspect of the Mexican government. And he's assembling a team in his new administration, people like Marcelo Ebrard and Luisa Maria Alcalde Luján, who are acclaimed public servants and activists as well. So it's really kind of a different team and assemblage.
Lupita, yeah, you're part of the younger generation of Mexicans that have demanded change. Yeah. Why with this man?
Well, I think the main issue that characterizes him right now, at least for me, would be his internal security policy, which we are in the midst of a very violent era for Mexico. What
was it, 29,000 murders last year?
Correct, and we have more than 30,000 people disappeared throughout the country. And this violence, it's very tangible, very real in our daily lives, much more than macroeconomics could be. So I think one of the main reasons people talk that Mexico is an unequal country, that, you know, we have the disparity between the most rich and the most poor. However, this disparity has existed since the 80s, since the 90s. So why is AMLO winning today? Why is he not only winning, but, you know, swiping the rest of the parties? And I think it's because suddenly the war on drugs and its repercussions on our daily lives in Mexico have been so big that at some point we've had to demand some sort of change.
And you come from one of the most violent parts of the country.
Yeah.
Would it be fair to say Tamaulipas?
Tamaulipas,
which is up in the north of the country, very close to the border with the United States. An awful lot of murders, drug-related murders and other reasons down there. So what does it feel like when you are there? Do you feel genuinely worried?
I do.
For your safety?
Of course. When I left Mexico, I left in 2010, and things were starting to get really gruesome there. We started to have curfews just to get out. We needed to get back home by 7 p.m. or before sundown. And so this tangibility of violence in the state is not only reflected on our daily lives, but also on our perception of the government, because it turns out that also the collusion between the governmental, some parts of the government are colluded with the criminal organizations. And then that's where I think comes the big mandate that AMLO currently has, because he portrays as being outside of this not only corrupt circle, but criminal circle.
Where did it all go wrong for Mexico? I'll tell you a little story. I was there 32 years ago. I went to Tamaulipas, I went to Saltillo, to Monterrey, up there. I traveled around the country. I felt so safe. So where has it gone wrong?
I think is well, if I can come back to the question of corruption briefly.
Do you mind if we do that later?
Okay.
Because I am going to come back.
That's fine.
Yeah. But where has it gone wrong?
I think what happens is the narco-trafficking, where most of the cocaine is produced in Colombia, needs a route to get to the United States, which is the main consumption market. And I think now most of it comes through Mexico. It makes sense. The border is absolutely gigantic. According to a recent report of the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, 92% of the cocaine produced in Colombia, the cocaine consumed in the United States comes from Colombia. And about 70%, according to the third report, goes through the Pacific. So it's definitely Mexico. And the business is extremely lucrative. So what you need to do is to organize the territorial control of the routes. And that requires territorial armed control. And the result is what we know. Complete collapse.
Yeah, well, so how do you change that?
I believe that things went wrong when the army was sent, the army, an institution that its mandate is to, fight war, protect the territory from external invasion. It was sent to tackle an internal problem. Things also went wrong when the institution of the presidency, in a presidentialist government, began to, weakening, and there was no clear direction as to how the local governments would work together. So now we have the return of the caudillo, the figure of the local political leader that is living in complete impunity. And that in a way explains the complexity of the different forces that are fighting in the territory. Because we do not have a kind of clear confrontation of criminal gangs against a sort of police enforcement agency, but we have an entire criminalized state today.
Yeah, there was an entire police force in one particular area that was indicted for the murder of these students who disappeared.
Correct.
How do you end that? Levi, your thoughts on this one. How do you end that culture of violence? If the drugs are still passing through Mexico, if they're still getting into the United States, and there's every reason why those who do so would want this to continue, how do you end that when the police forces are being bought off and other authoritarian figures too?
Well, I think, I agree with much of what's been said. I would add, though, Mexico, of course, is not an isolated situation. You can't talk about these security concerns in Mexico without also talking about the U.S. And the fact is, since the 80s and the 90s, when NAFTA was put in place, a lot of Mexican jobs and industry have been killed off, and there's not a lot of really good alternatives for people. And so if you're going to talk about solving crime and solving corruption, you have to provide jobs and social security for people in ways that they might, have an incentive to not be working for criminal gangs and cartels or taking bribes as a police officer.
Okay, let's get around to his policies. Austerity, I mentioned it earlier on. I promise you we will come back to corruption, Francisco. He says there's going to be no presidential palace, no jet, only half the presidential salary, hardly any security detail. I do not want bodyguards. He expects the rest of the country to follow suit, doesn't he? And they're not really going to like it when it's in practice. They might like the idea, but not in practice.
Yeah, that's good. That's true, because public servants need, and we all need, some dignified income. We need dignified salaries. However, what he means with austerity, and I remember him coming last October here to London and talking to the public and saying, I know that austerity here in the UK, it's seen with a bad connotation, which means austerity for social spending, for issues such as health, etc., etc. But for me, I'm going to be the government of austerity in terms of luxuries of the political class.
Okay.
And that's what he is very, very, clear on labeling, that he is not going to be putting the army or the police forces or the bureaucracy or public servants in an undignified position. However, he is going to definitely cut all those perks that they are currently now using and abusing from the elite political class.
Okay, so that's what he's saying. Is he saying you don't have to suffer, but we will? We're prepared to suffer.
Yeah, but suffer, I mean, in very mild terms, because I was precisely listening to Gerardo Esquivel, who would be one of his economic advisors. And out of the budget that they are estimating for social programs, 70% of that budget could come from reducing completely, unnecessary.
Waste, yes.
Yeah, that today, like, positions of very high ranks are being created for, let's say, secretaries, personal secretaries.
So if it's not the austerity program that might make him lose popularity once the reality of his government comes in, what is the biggest danger he faces in terms of the public turning against it, would you say, Francis?
Yeah, I think austerity doesn't mean what is being applied in Europe. It means something entirely different. It's austerity for the political class. I entirely agree. It wants to have a government that doesn't spend too much in the luxury sense. The level of inequality and social exclusion in Mexico is such that a very small shift in income redistribution will produce very tangible results. And it seems to me that that's his strength. And the dangers are very likely to come from the political class that may not like this. If you're a business class and somebody says to you, I'm going to take 1% off your wealth in order to give it to them, then they're likely to say, no, we're not going to accept that. This is a very serious attack on private property. We're not going to accept it. It seems to me that that's where the possibility comes. And the second thing is, he has to make sure that the dependency on exports and import from the United States is reduced. Otherwise, the country.
And it looks like he might have a better relationship with the current US president.
Yeah, but he's already saying that he wants to review the relationship with the United States on a friendly terms. If he were to do that, he might antagonize interests in the United States that might link up with people inside Mexico to complicate his life. That's where the main danger comes from.
Is it right of me to have suggested at the beginning of this program, and you can all jump in on this one, that these ideas appear to be spreading across parts of Latin America? Because I note that he's very friendly with Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, who is facing massive protests in the country about his policies, social policies, which have led to massive poverty in Venezuela.
No, I would fundamentally disagree on that one. If AMLO got elected, it's because he managed to not look like Maduro. Yeah. In the Mexican
but they are friendly, aren't they?
Not really. Maduro sent a friendly kind of, congratulatory note, to which AMLO responded like he responded to everyone else. Okay. Imagine there were flags of Venezuela in the Mexican public transport saying, if he gets into power, we'll become Venezuela. And what he's been doing is precisely to use every word of his rhetoric to not be Maduro.
What he's done is slightly different, if I may. Yeah. The current government of Mexico is linking up with other conservative governments in the region to intervene illegally against Venezuela, whatever the rights or wrongs of that may be. And what AMLO said is that he's going to respect non-interference as a major political plank of his administration. And he already said he wants that same respect from the US, which has been humiliating the current government, and he wants to apply exactly the same to Venezuela. Now, some people have actually construed that to be he's like Maduro, he's not.
Okay, so the way to characterize it would perhaps be to say, listen, I'm not your enemy, because I'm not going to interfere in what you do, but I don't necessarily agree with what you're doing. Do you think, Levi, that AMLO's ideas, the populist movement that we've seen erupt in Mexico, in which the people have said enough is enough, is spreading?
Well, sure. I mean, I think, this sentiment that there is widespread corruption throughout certain kind of governance systems in Latin America is something that is definitely being expressed. But I also think it's something that's been expressed throughout time in Latin America's history, from Simón Bolívar to the leftist movements of the 60s and 70s in Latin America. I think that this is a new wave of something that's been happening again and again throughout Latin American history. Okay,
if we were to watch another country and see if it particularly is following this trend, which one do you think it would be? Levi first?
I think Mexico is in actually kind of a very unique position now because of AMLO's presidency, and particularly because of how bad the last president was in Mexico, Enrique Peña Nieto. It was just a historic, an overwhelming sense of corruption and violence in Mexico. For instance, the numbers of students and migrants and journalists and political candidates murdered in the country skyrocketed during his presidency. So we have to remember that AMLO, as much as his charisma is part of his success, it's also just the overwhelming weariness that exists in Mexico for a change and for something better.
It was about 150 politicians alone killed during the presidential election.
The run-up to the
plus 50 of their families, so connected to them, to the candidates themselves.
Can we talk about corruption again? I did promise you that we would come back to it. Before the program started, I asked every one of you if you'd had to pay a bribe in Mexico, because the survey I've read says that 50% of those people surveyed said yes, they have had to pay a bribe, and you sort of said no, not really. Oh yes, only a small one, just a bit here and a bit there. It is part of the way of life, isn't it? And so how do you end that?
Peña Nieto mentioned that corruption was a cultural entrenched thing in Mexican society. Now, regarding AMLO, AMLO's posture is more than, if there is a political will to shift this culture, the change has to come from the top to the bottom. And which this means is that if lay citizens, they take part in corruption, it is not really because the higher people are doing it, but the most important thing from a political and from a governmental and from to create a strong state and a good rule of law is to tackle the corruption on the highest positions.
Will you now refuse? Sorry, carry on.
Of course, yeah. I believe that AMLO won, not because he's a great mind, but because people are changing. And because the diversity of voters for AMLO, that come from the Jews and from the elderly, from the rich and for the poor. And that's what I see that could be a trend that could spread to Latin America. In the sense that we also see, let's say, at the Argentinian society protesting in the streets to, for instance, legalize abortion. But it's the people that are changing rather than the leaders themselves necessarily.
Will you refuse now to pay a bribe
Absolutely,
if you were asked?
as well as all of my friends. Why? Because there is a possibility of regaining belief in the political institutions. But we've been living in an almost self-sustained society in which we have to provide for ourselves. We have to educate our children privately, go to private clinics. We need to, give money to the poor on a daily basis because, you just feel like they need your support. We need a state. That's what AMLO is promising, the possibility of rebuilding a state.
Francisco, I'm going to ask you about your country, which is Chile,
in
just a moment, but you have something to say.
Well, I think we have to be honest, and it is a way of life. There's no question about it. People are practical. If you have to get things done, you have to pay. I mean, that's as simple as that at the moment. They voted to change all of that. That doesn't mean to say it's already there. It's not there. And people talk about incentives to, trying to eliminate corruption, but there is also punishment. And there had been already sections of the police that had been sacked because of blatant corruption and illegal activities and criminal activities. So that can be done. He's got such a mandate that he can combine, a carrot and a stick easily in order to actually go through purging the state that he said he wants to construct. Because his reform is called the fourth reform. First one's independence. The second one, 1857 with Benito Juarez. The third one was the Mexican Revolution. All of them quite substantial transformation. He's talking about the fourth one. So this is going to be substantial. I think he can do it because he's got such a powerful mandate.
And in Chile, people don't pay bribes. Should everybody look at your country as an example, or are there rotten apples there too?
At the level of the generals, there is a lot of corruption has been discovered and people have been sent to prison. But if you're trying to bribe a cop on the streets, you will get into trouble. So maybe there is, that to look for.
Yeah. Your mother has never paid a bribe in Mexico. She'll be pleased with what's happening now.
She's very happy. She likes very much AMLO. Yeah.
Okay. And Levi, you're in Mexico City. We should wrap up with you. He was mayor of Mexico City. Now he's president-elect of the country. Does Mexico City itself feel a safer place than it used to be, perhaps because of him? And thereby, that might be reflected across the country.
Well, I will say I was out on the streets during election night, and I was in the Zocalo, the main square here in Mexico City, and there was some, apprehension in the beginning about, is it going to be safe? What's going to happen with the elections? We're not sure. And I can tell you that night, it ended up being very safe. It was a very happy moment. There were grandparents and children and everyone out on the street, and it felt like a really festive, almost kind of family atmosphere. So I think that there is a lot of hope that certain areas of Mexico City still are seen as dangerous, but a lot of people are hoping that yes, something might change and that things might get a little safer.
Well, listen, thank you. It's the first hopeful story I've heard out of Mexico for a very long time. In my job, I've been reporting an awful lot on the terrible things that have happened in that country. I loved it when I was there. I hope it goes back to a certain stability,
absolutely,
if not absolute. Muchas gracias to all of you for taking part in this discussion. And the great thing is that we actually have some kind of agreement that there is possibly a way forward for a wonderful country. So thank you, all of you, for taking part in the program. Thank you for watching. And from me, David Foster, from the Roundtable team, adios, hasta luego.